Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Otram's YouTube channel. Today we've got an 80 series Land Cruiser that's got some front pinion bearing noise. We already took this for a test drive with the chassis microphones hooked up and narrowed it down to the front pinion. And I realized I've never done a video on rebuilding a high pinion 8-inch diff, so we're gonna do that today. Let me move the camera over and we'll get started. So the first thing we're gonna do is drain the front diff, but the first step of draining anything is to make sure you can get the fill plug open, because we don't want to drain it without being able to refill it. So on this one, it's a 24 millimeter fill plug. We're gonna pull that out. And then your drain plug will either be a 24 millimeter socket or a 10 millimeter hex if it's had the low profile plugs put in it. This one's got the 10 millimeter hex. So we're gonna pop that out. And we'll let that drain. And then it's always a good idea to check the magnet to see if you've got any metal shavings on it. This one doesn't, which is a good sign. I'm gonna let this drain and then I'll move you around to the side and we'll start taking the spindle apart so we can get the axles out. So the first thing I'm gonna do is get the caliper out of the way, and there's two 17 millimeter bolts holding it onto the knuckle. So we're gonna take those off, but we're gonna loosen both of them first, because if you only loosen, or if you take one fully out and then you try to loosen the other one, you'll run into issues with the caliper wanting to flop on you. And now that they're loose, use my little electric ratchet to zip them out. And I've got caliper hooks, and we're just gonna hook the caliper up on the spring to keep it out of the way. You do not want these dangling on their hoses. And all of this should come apart pretty easily because we just did knuckles on this not too long ago, but it had a bunch of other issues and we couldn't hear that it had pinion noise over the other issues that it had. Fixed all the other noises, and then you could hear the pinion noise. The guy lives like 2 hours away. He took it to his local mechanic who found the pinion nut loose, or not loose, but finger tight, but still staked. So the bearings had worn and loosened up. He tightened it up and it made the noise worse. So we'll see what that looks like when we get there. But anyway, long story short, this should come apart pretty easy. So we're going to take a chisel and work these dust caps off. And then we need to take the snap ring off the end of the axle. I've got these parallel opening snap-on or snap ring pliers. These are from Wild. I think Snap-on makes a similar set. I really like these, but we'll take snap ring off. And then we're going to take these hub flange nuts off, and they're a 12 millimeter. Come on. And then, let me zoom you in. We're left with the cone washers in here. So what I like to do is take a brass hammer, stick it against the end of the cone washer, and then give them a couple whacks, and they'll come off. These came off real easy. If this had not been done recently, those would have taken some more hits. Then we can just slide the flange off, Take our gasket off. And then we've got a tab that's bent over this outer lock nut. We're going to bend that backwards. And those are not reusable. And then we're going to take our 54 millimeter hub socket. And take the nut off. And please, 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 by the hub socket, don't just beat these on and off with a chisel. You ruin the nuts. And then we'll pry the locking star out of here. And again, this is not reusable once it's been bent. And then there's an inner nut. So we'll take that one out. And I've got two different buckets on the ground. I've got one for old parts and one for parts I'm going to wash. And then we can take our hub and brake rotor off. There's a big fat washer in here, so put your thumbs in when you slide this off to hold it. Because we just did wheel bearings and everything on this truck, so we're not going to repack those. So I'm going to leave those be. And now we can take 14 millimeter and take all these spindle bolts out. Go. We'll set these guys off to the side. And now we're going to undo this 12 millimeter bolt up here that holds our ABS sensor in, because we want that out of the way before we pull the Burfield joint out, so we don't mess up the end of it. And sometimes these can be pretty sticky. And you also want to look on the end to see if there's any metal shavings. This one's good, so we're going to set it off to the side. And with that sensor out of the way, now we can take our actual spindle off. And I'm just going to take a brass hammer and I'm going to hit it. Your wheel bearings ride on, you'll see 3 stepped surfaces. The wheel bearings ride on the outer one, so just tap on the inside step to knock that loose, to make sure you're not hitting the surface so you're not hitting the surface that the wheel bearings ride on and causing any dings. And now we can pull our axle shafts out. And I should have mentioned, I've got drain pans under here, because if this were not a fresh rebuild, this would very likely be Burfield soup and a lot of gear oil in here, and it'll all glob out when you take that spindle off. So we're going to pop that out. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. I may have to clean it up. But there are flats on the top and the bottom. Well, there's flats on 2 sides of this that you've got to line up with the knuckle bearings to pop it out. So we're going to slide that out. Set it down. So yeah, there's our axle shafts out so that we can pull the front diff. I'm going to go throw all this in the parts washer, and then I'll come back and we'll start taking the front diff out. Actually, before I take you underneath to do the diff, we're going to take the tie rods, or the rear tie rod off, because it makes it way easier to get the diff in and out. So we got to take this cotter pin out of here. And then that's a 19 millimeter socket. And then you can rent a tie rod puller, you know, from most auto parts stores. I'm going to use hammer nut because they're fast, easy, and there's no chance of busting the boot when you do it this way. And it helps if you turn the air compressor on before you do this. There we go. There's one. So now we can head underneath and start taking the diff out. So now we can go ahead and take our drive shaft loose. Come on. And when you're trying to spin this, you're fighting the viscous coupler in the T-case, so it can be really tight to spin. Oh, that's handy. I was gonna grab that bolt with the wrench to try to spin this around, but it was actually loose enough that it just undid. And I'm just going to give that a little tap. Just knock it loose. And I'm going to bungee cord it. Up out of my way. You could take it completely off, but there's really not much reason to when we can just strap it up out of the way here. And then if you follow this wiring harness around, there are two plugs up here that we need to undo. There's one of them. Come on. There we go. And then there is a breather line too. So we're going to tuck all that off to the side. And there's two 12mm nuts and two 12mm bolts holding this actuator on. We're going to pop those out of the way. And before you pull this off, like I've got this diff unlocked, so you just need to remember that you're unlocked and put this back in the same way you took it out. Come on. And on that one, the stud came out with the nut. Not a huge deal. And we'll grab a little pry bar. Wiggle this guy out. And there's a guide pin down here that it likes to get hung up on. There we go. And then there's just a gear on the backside here that engages with the shift mechanism. Oh, and this is the nut that I was telling you about that was loose. And this is the original stake where the original preload was set. And they noticed that this was loose. So they tightened it about another quarter of a turn, which the only reason that this nut would be finger tight, with that stake not having come undone, like when they started the stake was still in here, is the bearings have worn out and loosened up. So by tightening this, they've shifted the pattern on the gear to take up the slack in the bearing. It also feels like they tightened that way too much. So yeah, that is not how you do that. So now we're ready to take the diff out, and we can just start going around and taking out all of these 12 millimeter nuts. And then there's a washer behind each one as well, but I'll come back with a magnet and get those. That one, the whole stud's gonna come out. Go. I'll just come back with a magnet and grab all those washers off so I don't lose them. And you'll see this long stud that's coming out for the locker. You know, that goes all the way through the housing, and then the other one would have been up here, which is why we took the tie rod out, because when you're trying to wiggle this out, this will hit the tie rod before you can get off this stud a lot of the times. So now we've got all our nuts off, and you know, you always want to double check because it's easy to miss some of them up here on the top. But now we can just come under here and push under the pinion. And we're hanging up on the locker mechanism. So I'm gonna push my finger in this hole where the gear was and push the coupler over to lock it. And sometimes you gotta turn the pinion while you're doing that. But there we go, now we're out. Come on. What are we hanging up on? I think we're just stuck on this stud now. There we go. Oh. And those are getting heavier, or I'm getting too old for this. But there's the diff out. I'm gonna go put that in the parts washer and clean it before I start taking it apart. And I'm also gonna wipe out and clean out as much of this housing as I can because it's still got old grease contamination residue. And then I'll, clean up this gasket surface with a razor blade and a wire wheel before we put the diff back in. But yeah, I'll get all that cleaning up and then we'll come back. Okay, so we've got the diff out of the parts washer from its first go round, and I've got it mounted to my workbench. And the first thing I'm gonna do is match mark the bearing holders. Not as important on this one since the bearings are two different sizes, but on the other ones, it's nice to do. And this, at least, if I mark it, I know which, so I can't flip my bearing housings around backwards. And I'm also gonna mark my retainer tabs. And I'm just doing 3 dots on one of them and 2 dots on the other. So those are marked. And then we want to check how much backlash we have so that when we put this all back together, we can get it in the same ballpark that we took it apart. Since we're not putting new gears in, we want it to be, roughly where we took it apart so that we have the same pattern. And you probably aren't gonna be able to see that, so let's see if we can move this up. And gonna zero it in one direction. So that's showing about 12 thousandths of backlash right there, which is quite a bit more than we'd really want. I'm gonna spin over to a different spot in the ring just to see. And the other shop really tightened the pinion too tight when they adjusted up the pinion nut. Okay, so that's, we're falling off there. Apparently, my dial indicator has a sticky spot in it now. But yeah, we're still getting about 11 thousandths. So I'll probably do it. I normally set them like 7 to 8 thousandths. So we'll see how this feels once it goes back together. And I'm gonna take apart and lube my dial indicator so it stops sticking like that. It seems okay. We'll see. Anyway, with measurements done, and actually I'm gonna write that down before I forget. And the beauty of steel tabletops is I can just put notes on them. And we can take our retainers off of here. And then we can take these 17 millimeter bolts loose. And we're going to need the bigger impact. I'm going to take my brass mallet and just tap the retainers off. And then pull this out as a set. And just watch out because you've actually got carrier bearing race and the adjuster for each side. We're going to replace the carrier bearings, so we don't really care about their races. So I'm going to set the races off to the side, put everything else in my pile of parts I'm going to wash. And I'm going to set my carrier off to the side as well. Flip this guy over. Yeah, I really cranked that down. So we're going to take 30mm socket and knock that nut off, which will let us take the drive flange off. And then I'm going to put the nut back on there temporarily. I'm going to get a brass drift, and you can kind of see from the end of this drift, I've used this a lot for this purpose. And then I'm going to, well, bearings are really loose because normally it takes some more hits than that, but that's why I put that nut back on to keep my pinion from falling out and hitting the ground. So we'll set that off to the side, and you've got your pinion, and then you've got your crush sleeve. We're going to put a new crush sleeve and a new pinion nut on this. And we can just take a pry bar and pop this pinion seal out. And then you've got rear pinion bearing and this oil slinger, and the fan blades point away from the bearing. Put that in our pile of things to wash. Actually, I'm going to wash these bearings too, just to see if I can see why they're making noise. And actually, I can see anyway. You're not going to be able to see this on camera, but looking down at this bearing race, you can see the wear marks in it. And then I'll flip this back over. And we're going to knock the outer bearing race out. The fun part is there's also an oil slinger down here, or oil like return thingy. We want to find a driver that just barely fits through the hole, so that when we drive this through, we're driving the oil retainer and the bearing. And this one is apparently a hair too big. I go grab another set of drivers. That's rather handy. The right size driver was already on the long handle. And I just ruined that oil retainer. Sometimes you can knock them through along with the race and all in one piece and reuse them. This one, not gonna be that way. So I'm gonna take just a regular punch. And there's our bearing race, and then this washer retainer sits behind it in there to hold oil up against this outer pinion bearing. So I'm gonna order one of those from Toyota since I just butchered it. But while we're in here, I can flip this over. And I can knock my inner race out. And when you're looking down the bore, there's cutouts to, you know, put a chisel on to drive these out. And you want to work back and forth because otherwise they'll get cocked in there and stuck. And then there's our inner pinion race, and I don't know if you're able to see it, but it's discolored from wear across the bearing face. But now that this is stripped down and I've got everything apart, I'm gonna put it back in the parts washer and clean it again, and then I'll bring you back for actual putting it together. Realized I've never showed where the magic happens. This is our automatic parts washer. And it is awesome. You can load a whole front end's worth of parts in there and then come out clean without any scrubbing. So now that the rest of my diff parts are clean, bring it back over to the bench. And one of the nice parts about the parts washer is it heats everything up. So it expands the carrier, or not the carrier, the third member housing just enough that it is way easier to drive the pinion bearings in, or the pinion bearing race in while they're hot. Because these can be an absolute bear to get in there. There's the big one in. That's always the one that's hard to get going. And then I got lucky and I had one of these oil retainers in my parts supply. So I'll stick that down in there. And then I can go ahead and stick my outer pinion race in there. And it seems that race driver might be just a hair big. There we go, now we're in there. I don't know if you can see it, but I used the outer pinion race to drive that retainer in there. Ooh, and I'm gonna set this down because it's really, I don't know if you guys are gonna be able to see it, but there's some little dents, like indentations on the carrier. One here, one over here. And those are for a bearing puller to slot into. Snug that up. And that's the easy side with the puller. And on a non-E-locker dip, it's the same on both sides. Over here, we get the added fun of this extra wide bearing. I don't think, that is not gonna fit. Let me go grab a wider puller from the other side. And there we go, grabbed a slightly wider puller bar out of my snap-on set. And there's both of our carrier bearings off. I'm going to go ahead and take the coupler out of my way now for the locker to make it easier to press that bearing back on. And I will go move you to the other side to the press, and we'll be back. Okay, so I've brought you over to the dark corner of the back shop so we can press the bearings on and off. We're going to start with our pinion. And I'm going to put my bearing splitter on there. And snug it up. And it's just in between, like right behind the pinion head, under the bearing. Stick that in there. I'm going to put a piece of aluminum on top to protect the shaft. And the air over hydraulic pump that I put on this, greatest thing since sliced bread. It used to have a hand pump that took forever. And then you'll see we've got the master shim on here. We're going to leave that alone since we're not re-gearing, and we're taking a coil bearing off and we're putting a new coil bearing on. This should be the right spacing. So we're gonna leave that. We're gonna double check it when we put this back together, but that should be fine. And then we've got our new bearing. Just slip it on there. Actually, before I do that, I've got a sleeve that I'm gonna use to press, and I'm gonna make sure that that slips all the way down so we don't bind. And then I've just got another piece that I'm gonna stack to take up some space. And one of these days, this will get done retracting. There we go. It gets stuck sometimes. Go. And the 20-ton press from Harbor Freight is plenty to do this. I did this for years on a 12-ton Harbor Freight press. There we go. And then we need to press our carrier bearings on. Just put my carrier up here. Same thing, I'm gonna make sure my sleeve goes all the way down. And I'm also going to make sure that my sleeve doesn't interfere with the cage, because we don't want to crimp the cage. And those just press down until they bottom out. And the nice thing with doing the big bearing first is the coupler support comes out past it. So when we flip it, we don't have to worry about hitting the cage on the bottom. So we can take our smaller bearing, make sure we can spin freely, and just a topper. And there we go, there's all of our bearings pressed. I'll take you back over to the other side and we'll start putting this diff back together. We're back at the bench. I've got this pointing pinion up. And the first thing we're gonna do is drop the outer pinion bearing in. And I like to just do a sanity check and make sure it spins freely. And I'm gonna take a little bit of gear oil and apparently glug it all over the ground, but also lubricate that bearing, so that when we're setting our preload, that's lubricated and not running dry. I'll wipe up my mess there. And then we're gonna put the oil slinger with the fins facing up. Put that in there. And before I put the seal in, I'm gonna take a little bit of assembly lube and I'm gonna lube the inside sealing surface so that when we start this up, it doesn't run dry and tear the seal. And if you were like actually doing new gears and going back and forth, you wouldn't put the seal in yet, but because we're not going to have to change the shim, I'm just gonna go ahead and tap it in now. And I'm just gonna slowly work my way around the edge. And once that's driven in there most of the way flush, I'm gonna take my Wits End front diff seal driver, because it's got a nice recess for the seal, And I'm just going to use that to make sure everything's flush. This one's actually for doing like the side seals on 100 series, 4Runner, stuff like that. But it also works well there. And then I can take my companion flange, and I like to take a little bit of sealer, if I can get the tube open, a little bit of sealer, and just put it on the inside here. And that way, when I put my pinion up through there, it'll seal the spline so no gear oil can leak out that way. And then I'm going to take my pinion and I'm going to put some gear oil on the inner bearing. I'm going to take my new crush sleeve, big end down, and set it on there. And I should have really opened all of these things before I picked stuff up. And then on the pinion splines themselves, I like to put a little bit of thread lubricant because I've had trouble with the pinion nuts galling the threads. So I use this ARP fastener assembly lube. It just seems to help the process go easier. And I can feed this up through the hole. And tap that down a little bit. And then I'm going to zip this up a little bit. And there you can see we've taken up the slack, but because we haven't crushed the crush sleeve yet, we've still got quite a bit of play there. So and this is just a bracket that I've made that I can bolt on here to hold the pinion while I tighten everything up. And it helps to put the socket in there first, because it never fails that you get that bolted on off center. Zip those up, and that will let me hold that while I start to tighten up that crush sleeve. And you want to go real slow at this and check for slack often, because it's real easy to overshoot the crush sleeve and over tighten it and have to start over again with a new crush sleeve. There we go, and now we're starting, like we don't have any audible play anymore, and we're starting to get a little bit of resistance. So I'm going to take my dial torque meter and I'm getting just about 15 to 17 inch-pounds of drag, which is about where we want it. I may go a little bit tighter because that's going, right now I've got the leverage of my bar on there. So I'm going to scooch this up just a hair tighter. And then I'm going to take that bar off. And there we go. I've got right about 18 inch-pounds of drag on there. So then we're going to look at where our notch is and into the housing. I don't know if you're going to be able to, if I can zoom this in enough. And I can't get my camera up much higher, but there's a notch in the end of the pinion shaft. We're going to take a chisel and dent that pinion nut in to lock it. And now we can turn this over and start putting the rest of it back together. Okay, so now that we've got the pinion all set and in there, we're ready to start putting the carrier back in. And I'm going to start by rolling the carrier over, setting it down gently, and then I'm going to put some assembly lube on the locker coupler. Oh, and I realized after I set it, the pinion preload that I called out at like 17, 18 foot-pounds is a hair over like the 15 foot-pound or inch-pound set spec. We're a hair over, but not enough that it will really hurt anything. So we're fine there. And then sometimes you've got to put your finger in through the side and wiggle the spider gears to get all the teeth to line up on this. So then I can take my bearing race and set it on there and put this guy upright. Put my other bearing race on. And this is a little bit of a juggling act. And then slide that down into the locker fork. And set that in there. And I should mention, I already wiped the bores where these sit clean, as well as the insides of these bearing caps. And I got ahead of myself and should have put the adjuster on there because it gets trapped on the other side of the shift fork. There we go. And when you're putting these adjusters in, I like to drop them in and then make sure they spin freely because it's very easy to cross thread these. And then you also want them slightly loose at this stage. And then I'm going to put 2 bolts in my bearing cap. And I'm going to lightly start those bolts and then drop my cap down so that it centers on the threads. Make sure my threads still spin. And I will lightly run those down with the right size socket. It's a 17. And again, make sure my adjuster still spins. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but see how this adjuster's not going all the way down? I am cross-threaded somewhere, and it's keeping it from seating. I don't know how many hundreds of these diffs I've done, and it's still a pain when you're trying to get these to seat. There we go. So now my cap's all the way down and doesn't rock. But as you can see, I can pull the diff back and forth quite a bit. So what I'm going to do is this ring gear side adjuster, I'm going to loosen, need to loosen my pinion side a bit. I'm going to tighten up my ring gear side. Until I just run out of backlash. And there we go. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but there's just barely backlash. But my pinion side adjuster is still loose. And now I'm going to take my dial indicator that I have awkwardly set up here. I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see that. But I'm going to set that to 0. And then I'm going to tighten this side until that needle just starts to move. And that means I've taken up all the slack between the two. And then I'm going to tighten this another 1.5 to give me some preload. And then so right now we're at about 6/1000ths of backlash. So I'm going to loosen this side. Now, I'm going to loosen this side by 1 notch and tighten this side by 1 notch. That way we push the ring further away. And there we're at about 9/1000ths, I guess 10/1000ths. Yeah, we're right on 10/1000ths. So that's about the biggest backlash we want. Normally I like to go to like 7 to 8/1000ths on these, but we had quite a bit of backlash to begin with. So I'm going to roll this to another spot because you want to check your backlash in a couple different places. Yeah, see there we're about 8. And there we're about 8. So I'm gonna torque these caps real quick and then double check that again, but it's easier to set this all with them slightly loose. So I'm gonna torque these to 70 foot-pounds. And I should have also mentioned, I went by my match marks when I put those bearing caps back on, just to be sure they were all good. Yeah, so we're about 8 thousandths there. About 7. Between 7 and 8. So I'm going to call that happy. And it's also, you can tell a lot just by how this feels as you're spinning it. If it's nice and smooth, you're probably pretty close. When you're way out, it just feels funky. Let me see if I can move you around, because I'm gonna paint some marking compound on these. So I've gone ahead and painted gear marking compound on a couple of teeth, and then while wearing a glove, because you want some resistance while you're turning this on the ring, I grabbed the pinion flange and spun this several times both directions. And it's really hard to see a pattern on used gears, especially higher mileage. And we're just doing this as a sanity check to make sure we're in the ballpark. But you can see it's easier to read on the coast side on a used gear. But, we're centered on the tooth, and we're not fully in the bottom, and we're not coming off the top of the tooth. So our pattern is pretty much centered. So we're good and happy there. So now what I'm gonna do, if I can find my thing, I'm gonna take out one bolt from each side. And add some red Loctite. And put those back in. And then take out the other two. I only take out one on each side at a time because I don't want it to jump off of my adjustment. And then we can go ahead and retorque those. And then we can go ahead and take our lock retainers, stick those on there. I'm going to put a dab of red Loctite on each of those bolts. Stick them in there. And then these are going to go to 15 foot-pounds. And now we're all set with building the diff itself. You know, I'll give it, another few spins just to make sure everything feels happy. It does. So I'll move you underneath and we'll get ready to put this back in the axle. Okay, so I've cleaned out the inside of the housing, as much as I can reach. And then I've cleaned all the old gasket off of the mounting surface here, and I've wiped this surface and the surface on the third member really well with brake clean, because you do not want any oil left on this for when you put the sealer on. And I'm just using Toyota's transaxle gasket maker here. I'm just going to put a nice bead around here. You can use the paper gasket like the factory came with. I don't like doing that all that much because I've seen them leak too often. For some reason, my tube squeezer is not working well today. At all. I think I may have done this backwards or something. But anyway, so I've got sealer all around everything. I'm going to put a little extra here on the bottom just to make sure everything's good and sealed. And I'm going to grab the third member and pop it in there. And these are a lot of fun to get back in with these stupid long studs. There we go. Huh. That went in easier than usual. And you want to make sure there's like an ABS wire that runs over the top here, as well as your locker wires. You want to make sure you don't pinch those into the housing. And then we can put just a washer and a nut back on each of these. And then I'm going to use a electric ratchet just to zip these down. I'm going to crisscross them. And then these torque up to 20 foot-pounds. And I like to go around twice just to be sure. And you also want to, double check that you have all of the bolts in there. And then we had to lock this to get it to clear to come out. So I'm just going to slide my finger in and move the actuator back to the unlocked side. And then I can put the diff motor back in here. Put that long stud that popped out earlier back in. And a nut and a washer. And that guy. And then same thing, I'll torque these to 20 foot-pounds as well. If I can get on there. There we go. Helps if your torque wrench doesn't turn off. Okay. And then we can come back around and plug our diff wiring all back in. And the breather hose also. Come on. There we go. And then just as a sanity check, make sure we're not binding on anything. And then while we're under here, we'll go ahead and put our drive shaft back on. And I'm going to put a dab of blue Loctite on each of the drive shaft bolts. Sorry, my head's in your way. And we'll zip these in. And then these get torqued to 65 foot-pounds. There we go. Now we're all done underneath. Let me bring you back around and we'll start putting the outside back together. On the outside, and forgot to turn the camera on, but I've put new inner axle seals in. You don't absolutely have to change those, but you've got the axle shafts out. Now is the ideal time to change them since they are so common to leak anyway. So with those in, we can put our axle shaft back in. And again, there's flats on two sides of the berth that you got to line up to get them in there. The flats line up with these knuckle bearings. Stick that in there. And you may notice these are new shiny berths. We decided to go ahead and change the berths since we were having to pull everything apart again. Normally, you would want to clean all the grease out of here and repack it completely. We just had these knuckles apart, so we know what grease was used in there, so we can match it to fill it back up. And not worry about two different grease bases fighting each other. And I usually put, one of these pound tubs in each side. You got to be careful because if you put too much grease in here, when the berth gets hot, you'll end up pushing grease up the axle shaft and it'll come out and just make a huge mess. So you just want to make sure, you've got some room for expansion. And we're going to scrape the big boogies off of there. And then I'll just wipe up this seal surface. We just want big globs off of here so that when we put everything together, it doesn't squirt out. And then to make all this easier to stack back together, I like to put just two, these are exhaust manifold studs. Just lightly thread those in there. And then we can take our spindle gasket and just hang it on those studs. And with the spindle gasket hanging on there, all your bolt holes are aligned. And then we'll take our spindle. I've already cleaned the gasket surface on this. And I'm going to take a little bit of this grease and wipe it inside this bronze bushing to pre-lube it. It'll, work its way out there as you drive anyway. Stick that guy on. And then we can put our brake backing plate on. Followed by a gasket. And I should mention the cutouts, like there's one on the backing plate, there's one in the gasket, there was one in the spindle, and one in the spindle gasket. The cutouts all go at the bottom. And then we can put our dust shield on there, and the dot goes at the top. And then we can just start putting our bolts back in, and you just want to be careful that you don't cross thread anything. These are easy to cross thread, and if you cross thread them, you've ruined the knuckle. And then once those are started, you can take your two studs out. And then I'll just zip these in. Put the right socket on there, and then we'll zip these in. And then we're going to torque these to 34 foot-pounds. And I go around these a couple of times to make sure that they're completely seated, because these bolts are what holds your wheel on. So you don't want these coming loose. And we can take our hub and rotor and wheel bearings and put them all back on. And this is the ideal time to repack your wheel bearings. These are brand new bearings. Well, maybe a month old bearings, and grease. So no need to repack these. And I left the big washer in here, so we don't need to worry about that, but you do want to make sure that its tang is in the slot at the top. And then we're going to put one of our inner washers in, and I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see this, but somebody in the past has hit these with a chisel. And when you do that, it puts raised spots on the face. And the problem you run into with that is when the raised spot is in the middle and you put that locking sheet metal washer in there, when you turn the outside nut to do the final lock, the burrs grab that sheet metal washer and rip the tang out of the center of it, which negates having a locking washer in there. So I took all these and just licked them on the belt grinder to make sure they were smooth again. A lot of times we just put new wheel nuts on, and normally we have them in stock, but I didn't have any, so I just smoothed these out on the belt grinder real quick. And then we'll run that in. And then I tighten them to about 50 foot-pounds. and then turn the hub a few times, both directions, to seat the bearings. And then we'll back it off, tighten that finger tight, and then 1/8 to 1/4 of a turn more, and that'll give us the proper amount of drag. And then we can put our sheet metal star on there. And then our outer. And there is a much fancier Toyota method of doing this where you torque these and use a fish scale and all that jazz. I've never used that method because I learned the old school way. And then we'll tighten that up to about 50 foot-pounds. Recheck that our drag feels okay. And then we're gonna look, so this one has the most ear showing against a flat on the outside. So we'll bend that out. And tap that down. And then this one over here lines up best with the inner one. So we'll curl that back. And now our hubs are locked in, and the reason you don't reuse that sheet metal piece, it's the same as like when you bend a paper clip or something back and forth and eventually it breaks. You're hammering this over, and if you bend them back out straight, hammer them over, bend them back out straight, those tabs break off, which A, makes it so there's nothing holding this nut anymore, and B, leaves a tab of metal to go roll through your wheel bearings. So you don't want that. So yeah, those are all in. We'll put our flange on here in just a second. And before I put the hub flange on, I'm gonna put the caliper back on so that we can stick a pin in the rotor and use it against the caliper to counterhold while we torque these. Take my caliper, and I'm gonna make sure that my hose isn't twisted. Whew, there goes my fingers. And I should mention, I cleaned the rotor before I came back on camera. I'm just gonna put my bolts back in here. And again, these are really fine thread, so you want to make sure that you do not cross thread them. We get so many trucks in that when we go to actually torque the calipers back on, the bolts have been cross threaded and stripped out of the knuckle. And then you get to take it all back apart again and put another knuckle on. Because these torque to 90 foot-pounds, which is quite a bit. There we go. And I lied, we're actually gonna put the tie rod back on before we torque these to keep this from flopping around. So I've already set the tie rod back in there, and we'll just start a nut on there. And then these torque to 67 foot-pounds. Come on, getting close. Didn't feel right, so I went to go check it on the other side. Okay, this one's tightening now. Just didn't. Okay. And we just gotta get it to line up with the hole. A little bit more. Stick our cotter pin through. There we go. Now this isn't gonna shimmy around on us anymore. And I might as well throw our ABS sensor. Might as well throw the ABS sensor back in too, and you just wanna make sure this is clean and doesn't have anything on the tip, because the tip is magnetic. And if there's stuff on there, it won't read right. We'll fit that back in the hole. And you also want to make sure that it fully seats into the knuckle. Sometimes with rust and stuff, they don't fully seat, and you'll get weird intermittent ABS codes because the air gap is too big. And then there's just that single bolt that goes in there. There we go. Okay, now we're ready to put the flange on. So we've got our new hub gasket, and you'll notice it has 3, 1, 3. The 3 corresponds to the ones with the locating pin. And you want to be kind of gentle when you're feeding that over the threads, or you can tear it. Then we just take our flange, and these protrusions line up with those locating pins. And I'll just take a screwdriver. Now, that won't work on this one. Let's see if we can do it this way. You just kind of stick something in the end of the axle shaft there so you can pull it out and put our snap ring on. And then you want to make sure the snap ring spins, that it's all the way in the groove. And I like putting the snap ring on before I put the nuts on. It just seems to make it easier. And then with the snap ring in, you can go ahead and just pop your dust cap on. And then we can put our 6 cone washers in. And 6 flat washers. And 6 nuts. And then the reason I put the caliper on first is I can put a pin in the rotor. And then these torque to 26. And that pin just holds it so we don't have to fight the hub trying to spin. And don't forget to take the pin back out. And now we're all finished on the outside of the hub. I'm gonna let my sealer dry a little bit more, and then we'll go back around front and fill this back up. So I think I just filmed filling this up without actually having the camera running. So I cleaned up down here where my drain plug goes, put a new crush washer on the drain plug, put it in, torqued it to 39 foot-pounds, and then filled my fill plug with gear oil until it started to trickle out, and put my fill plug in, torqued to 39 foot-pounds. And with that, with the diff all full, all I've got to do is put the wheels back on this, torque them, and take it for a test drive, and check my locker for proper operation, and we'll be all set. Hopefully you found this useful. If you did, please like and subscribe, because it helps the channel grow, and that's what YouTube likes seeing. And it, gives me more motivation to make more videos. So hopefully you found that useful, and I will catch you on the next one. Thanks for tuning in.